Welcome into episode 406 of the Skate Podcast. Happy Monday, Bridget. Happy Monday, Scott. Don Sweeney spoke with the media on Sunday, which is a very rare opportunity to talk to Bruins management. There's been a few opportunities this year, more so than other years, simply for some preseason drama. Then you had the coaching change. So we've talked to Sweeney at times, but there's a lot of burning questions. And Bridget and Scott, I believe the two of you were in attendance for this press conference. So we're going to spend a lot of this episode reacting to what Don Sweeney had to say.
Yeah, and I'll go first with the biggest news to come out of it, which is that Hampus Lindholm is unlikely to return this season. I think we kind of sense that something like this could be coming. 3 weeks ago, he practiced with the team. And then he stopped practicing with the team, and they hoped he would come back after break. Then they had this mini training camp, this week of practice leading up to Saturday's game, and Hampus Lindholm was not on the ice with the team. So at the very least, you knew that if there wasn't a setback, that the plan had at least changed. And now it sounds like it's going to be a much longer term thing where Sweeney said there has not been a setback. He says his recovery from a fractured patella, which is your kneecap, basically, has just gone slower than anticipated. And he said they want to let it heal naturally. Basically, they don't want to force it. They don't want him to keep pushing himself the way he's been trying to get back. He also mentioned that there's going to be a follow-up procedure to remove some hardware that I guess had been irritating Hampus Lindholm once he got back on the ice. So, yeah, ultimately, probably the right thing to do. We had mentioned, throughout this, fractured kneecap is no joke. It's just a tough injury. It's very uncomfortable. There's just no... It's not an injury where it's like, oh, that happened, you get this done, and then there's a clear recovery. It was always kind of open-ended, and, as it turns out, it's just going to take probably the rest of the season, and you hope he gets 100%, has a full off season, and comes back for next year. The other update, or kind of non-update, was on Charlie McAvoy, where Sweeney said he's doing better, but there's no timetable, which is basically what we kind of already were aware of. Sweeney was asked in a couple different ways about Team USA's handling of McAvoy's injury, and he just stayed away from it. He was not interested in commenting on it or going at Team USA. He said, he got good treatment once he was in Boston, and that's all that matters. And that was as far as he was going to go with that.
Which it was, I was hoping for a little bit of tea, a little bit of drama from him being like, yeah, we would have liked to know sooner. Or so it sounds like he's not going to disclose it, but certainly the reporter sleuths will figure it out. I'm sure Elliot Friedman will have something coming up about, oh, this is what the Bruins were mad about, and this is whose fault it was, or whatever it may be. And also with Tkachuk's situation in Florida. So there'll be more information on it. It's just not going to come from Don Sweeney. And the reason why we didn't really know what the reason was, right? For this press conference, normally it's usually straightforward. It's like, okay, they fired Jim Montgomery, press conference. Normally we were expecting the next time to talk to him would be after the trade deadline, but instead it comes on Sunday. It felt, it's the classic, let's bury news on Sunday. And so there was more to come out of it, though, than just the injury stuff. And though the Hampus Lindholm thing was the first thing he started off with in his opening statement, so that was clearly the reason for that. Because they keep getting asked about Lindholm. And they keep... And Joe Sacco was probably like, what am I supposed to do? Everyone's going to ask every day. And just to put that to bed, yeah, he's not likely to come back this year. If you think they're going to make a deep playoff run, maybe he does, but probably not still. I feel like you're not going to see him. He's still been skating, Scott, right? but just not practicing anymore.
Yeah, he's been skating on his own, but it seems like it seems like they basically kind of rewound the rehab plan where like he's going to skate on his own, but they're kind of done with the like pushing him hard and getting him back on the ice with teammates and things like that.
Yeah. So that was the main update. But of course, we haven't had a chance to talk to him in a while. There was some Four Nations stuff and trade deadline stuff because that's coming up really quickly. There's only 5 games, right, until the trade deadline. So
Is it 6?
I think it's 5 now. But either way, we're 2 weeks away. And it's coming up close, and a lot of people have questions about what the Bruins were going to do. And the answer was from Don Sweeney was cautious, conservative, nothing crazy. Like he reiterated many, many times, this is not going to be a splashy week, a splashy trade deadline. He said, in the past, we haven't been afraid to make big moves, but this really isn't that kind of year. So I think he used the word cautious like 5 times when describing the trade deadline. And he also, in that same vein, was asked about what he's going to do with some of the UFAs before the trade deadline. Is there any extensions potential before the trade deadline? And he gave us more information really than I thought he would about Brad Marchand's situation. And you could definitely read between the lines about what he said about the others. So first, with Marchand, he said that since Four Nations is over, the camps from his side and Marchand and his agent, they're going to get back together and try to come up with a contract extension in the next 2 weeks here and at least know if it's going to happen or not. So it seems like that news is going to come in the next 2 weeks before the trade deadline. More than likely that will be settled. It sounded like that was the plan at least. And if it's not, then we can get into what that might mean. But anyway, so it looks like maybe Marchand extension gets done soon. Whereas when talking about the other UFAs, which I can just list them quickly if people haven't been aware of it, it's Trent Frederic, who we've talked about a lot, Marchand, Koepke, Brazeau, and Wotherspoon. And then Michael Callahan is kind of a weird situation we don't need to get into. But those other guys, he basically said, we're not extending them right now. Unless someone wants to make a phone call to me, essentially was the comment. Like he's like, well, if someone makes a call and we find a number that we can settle on, but it sounded like either those numbers are not close right now with somebody like Frederic, or there's no interest on at least one side for this to be a continued relationship. So I felt like you could read between the lines that Trent Frederic probably not here after the trade deadline, because what are you going to do? Get nothing for him, or are you going to get something for him? Because it doesn't seem like they one side or the other, maybe both sides, is going to come to an agreement on an extension.
Yeah, and there's a lot to break down. And again, we've talked about in the past, if you're a contender and you have some pending UFAs in your roster, there will still be people out there who say, I don't care if you're a contender, don't lose players for nothing. But the majority of people will look at a contender with some pending UFAs and say, use them as your own rental because you're a contender. And that's not where the Bruins are at. And in fact, they're not even a bubble team. At this point, they're just a non-playoff team. And yes, they're points-wise, they're not out of it, but if we're looking at points percentage and injuries, Scott, look at the injuries they have.
Technically, they are the definition of a bubble team. They're on the bubble.
Yeah,
they're 1 point out.
But if you peel it back, do you really feel that way the next 25 games without Lindholm, without McAvoy, and
it's just a really big bubble.
And also, and look, honestly, this is not what my opening shift is, so we're kind of deviating. Furthermore, again, look at their team numbers. They don't play like a bubble team. They play like a team that's lucky to be where they are.
I know. I'm not just we all know where we stand. I'm just saying, definition of bubble team, that's what they are. That's where they are.
Okay. Then I will go back 45 seconds and redact that sentence. But that's not what my sentiment is. Basically, the Bruins aren't in a position to maintain their own pending UFAs as rentals for themselves, and they're admitting it now. So that's good. I have some questions about that, as I'm glad they're doing it. The question is, for me, is why? Not why are they doing it? Why has Don Sweeney acknowledged this? Because I feel like it's still in his best interest from a job security perspective to try to GM for today. Because if you're a GM and missing the playoffs could potentially lead to you being fired, I don't see many GMs willingly selling some pieces. Now, Scott, you mentioned in the past he might make some moves that are helping a team now and tomorrow as it pertains to maybe buying, and he's leaving that window open. But ultimately, I just feel like he may have had some conversations with Cam and Charlie Jacobs where maybe he knows that he's still got a job next year, even if they miss the playoffs. And maybe that took some weight off of his shoulders and allowed him to be more willing to maybe do the right thing here. We can look at that a little bit later on. But my main question and my main opening shift, which is to you guys and everybody listening, regardless if the Bruins do the right thing at the trade deadline this year, do any of us have confidence in Don Sweeney going forward? And I'm not being a wise ass. I'm genuinely asking because he's been a GM for 10 years now, coming up on, I believe he was hired in May or June of 2015. And when you're the GM of a hockey team for a decade, you're going to have your good moments and you're going to have your bad moments. When you look at the main parameters of what a GM's responsibility is, you look at drafting and developing, you look at free agency, you look at trade deadline acquisitions, and everything in between. And I think that Don has definitely had his moments in all three categories, good and bad. Depending on the category, maybe more bad than others. So I'm not sitting here saying he's been a terrible GM. The Bruins have been very competitive in his tenure. And the Bruins have made win-now moves along the way. But going forward, do Bridget and Scott and listeners, do you have faith in Don Sweeney going forward, regardless if they do the right thing at this deadline? And I want to challenge everybody on this podcast to really talk about that and play it out and just talk about it. So that's my opening shift. But a lot to get into, obviously, with this press conference.
Yeah. So I'll start. I'll answer your question with a question. What is the goal of a retool? It seems kind of simple, but
yeah.
What is the goal of a retool?
To be right back in it next year.
Right.
Or within a couple years, right? Like, yeah. It's to avoid a prolonged rebuild.
Mm-hmm.
And to become a contender again. So if that's the goal, what I would point out is that Don Sweeney was named general manager and his first task was to retool. Now, he had a couple whiffs in there in the 2015 draft, and yet still built a team that got to the Stanley Cup final 4 years later. So you would have to have, now I know fans won't because a lot of fans just hate Don Sweeney and think he sucks at everything. I would point out that he already they didn't win the cup, but he executed a retool in the sense that he took a team that had missed the playoffs, that needed to shed some contracts, needed to get a little younger, and had them in the Stanley Cup final 4 years later. There are a lot of general managers who have not been able to do that. So be careful what you wish for. So I don't know if Don Sweeney is the right guy to do it again or not. I don't know if he would get that opportunity. All I would say is, by and large, he did the job once already. And so maybe there's someone else out there who's better. I'm not even opposed to that. Like, I'm open to that idea. But you got to be careful. Like, there's plenty of GMs who don't execute a retool well. So that would be my response as to why I would have at least a little bit of faith, and probably more faith than I think most Bruins fans probably would.
It's the classic devil you know versus devil you don't, right?
Yeah. I'm with you, Scott. If I had answered first, I would have said something similar. It's, to me, he's, you could tell the apprehension, but the acceptance that he needs to do this boring deadline and retool, right? Like that was the vibe I got today, was like, though he didn't want to, he accepts that what's best for the team is to not go all in at the deadline. Not because he even said, like, my competitive nature makes this difficult. Because, you know, as someone who wants to make the aggressive moves and like really go for it, and they're just not in the position to do it this year. And if you think about what his failings were this year, it's like the main one to me is the Elias Lindholm situation, like underperforming. And he was asked about that too. And basically he was like, yeah, we both sides are not happy with the situation, with the way that Lindholm hasn't been able to impact the games enough. But then you look at like the other stuff, it's not that bad. Like I know they're in a situation where they might miss the playoffs or maybe just barely make the playoffs, and it's not the best hockey to watch, and it's not what fans are used to over the past few seasons, but it's still, I'm wary of just watching what other franchises have had their GMs do and it being terrible. Like maybe we're just afraid that there might not be a better option, and that's why Scott said careful what you wish for. Even the moves that Sweeney did make in the offseason seemed like the logical thing to do at the time. It wasn't like that's out of left field, like this doesn't make any sense. And obviously if Twayman doesn't end up performing up to his contract, that's another question. If Zadorov and Lindholm continue to not, make those contracts look good, that's another question. But it seems like Sweeney has at least accepted the role of essentially mostly selling. And it feels like maybe he's going to survive this, even if they're sellers this year.
Well, so to that point, do you two feel as though what I mentioned could be true, where he has some affirmation from ownership that he is safe regardless of the outcome? And do you think that it's easy for Sweeney and ownership to kind of say to themselves, even though they haven't been good even with these people in the lineup this year, but do you think Sweeney and Jacobs are kind of saying, well, we got the Lindholm injury now for the season and McAvoy's out for indefinitely and other things where, you know what, if we do miss the playoffs, it's because of injuries, not because of anything else. And then do you feel that a conversation in general has happened that has made Don feel comfortable to go forward with a trade deadline that might not make the team better in the immediate weeks, but as soon as the summer?
Well, so they've definitely had conversations. Now, whether he's gotten direct assurances that his job's safe, I don't know. Like, I don't know if ownership would give him that, if Neely would give him that, if ownership would give Neely that. Like, there's the whole chain of command of like who's giving who assurances anyways. But what I would assume has happened is that he has at least gotten the sense that everyone is on board with retool, small sell-off, whatever you want to call it. Like, because Bridget, you're right. Like, Sweeney sounded like someone today who had kind of accepted this team's fate and without directly saying it, more or less acknowledged like what they're going to be doing over these next 2 weeks. And I don't know if he's doing that if the tone of his conversations with Neely and with Charlie Jacobs instead was like, we better find a way to get to the playoffs. Like, I thought we were going to be a contender this year. Like, what the hell? We got to get there. Like, if that was the tone of those conversations, then I don't think you hear the Don Sweeney that you heard on Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think you'd be getting a Don Sweeney who wants to figure out something to do to make the playoffs and save his job. So there's got to be some level of, acceptance across every level of the organization that like, okay, we're all on board with this. And that might include telling Don Sweeney his job safe? It might not. It might just be, hey, like, this is what we're doing because this is what makes sense. And that's what we're doing, Don. Like, you figure it out from here.
Yeah, and like if you do that correctly and we like the way you handled that, like we'll reevaluate. And also I will say GMs have been given reassurance by owners and it meant nothing. So like the Henrys did that with Heimblum not that long ago. And told them, do this at the deadline, your job's safe, and then they fired him. So like I'm sure that reassurances either way would be taken kind of with a grain of salt. Not saying that the relationship between ownership and management is bad. I'm sure it seems like it's actually pretty good, but
it's very good.
Sometimes people go back on what they said to save their own face. And we've seen it in this town before as well. So I feel like you'd take that with a grain of salt anyway.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I definitely think that this ownership management group is very cliquey. They're very, country club boys. Like there's that element of something would have to go really south, I feel like, for them to make moves. I think, like, because to Scott's correction to me earlier, despite how bad they've been, you can look at the standings and they are just a few points out of the playoff picture. And Jeremy Jacobs, Charlie Jacobs, you bet your ass that it would go against their history to not want to make the playoffs when you're that close, right? Like, because in the standings.
That was a question that Matt Vitor asked, and like he kind of had to ask it a second time because it didn't get a great answer the first time. But like he said, the Jacobs said that rebuilding isn't an option. Is that like something you're taking into consideration going into this trade deadline? And he kind of danced around it. So like I wish he would have given them more of a like legit answer, but it was brought up.
I also think though that's maybe I would have to revisit those comments from Charlie Jacobs, but I feel like he was talking about a rebuild, like a true rebuild, like 5 to 10 years going down to the bottom of the league type of situation. Like I feel like that's more what he meant in terms of it would be a hard sell. I don't think we have the appetite for it. And I don't think that's on the table here anyways. So I almost view that as kind of like a different conversation where I don't think they're at a point where they need to consider that.
Yeah, I just find it interesting. Like, I think when you're like, if you know the team and you've watched the team intimately as we do and fans do, you can look at this team and completely compartmentalize what the standings say right now. Because if they keep playing this way, I think they're going to finish closer to a bottom 10 team than a playoff team. But if you're Jeremy Jacobs, you could sit there and make the argument to Don, hey, the league is weak this year in the stand. We can make, like, I just feel as though it would go against Charlie Jacobs' MO and Jeremy Jacobs to be that close to the playoffs, despite how bad the team is. Let's be frank about that. To be this close to the playoffs and be like, no, Don, like, just do your soft sell. I don't see that. And in that case, obviously Don like wouldn't sell because missing the playoffs would go against what they want. But perhaps they have seen the light and ownership does realize this team just ain't it, and that the right thing for Don to do is to do this soft sell. And because of that, I do think they've given Don the green light. So this is kind of why I feel as though Don would not be doing a soft sell at all if ownership wanted to make the playoffs so badly this year, because to do so would jeopardize their chances. So I do think that there's been a conversation about the reality of the situation of the team. And I do think Don was given the green light, because if he wasn't, I don't think he would be soft selling, because he would be afraid to lose his job. And if he does soft sell after being given a green light by ownership and ownership turns around, to your point, Bridget, and still fires him, I would be very surprised by that, because despite my question to you guys a while ago, do you feel comfortable with Don going forward? For the record, whether I do or don't, I don't think he's going anywhere this offseason. because I just don't think they're going to do it. They seem very close, and yeah, it is the devil you know versus the devil you don't. I do think that there is a fear of mine that Cam and Don are too close to it for too long. Now, I'm not saying they both have to go, but I do think there's value in fresh eyes at some point. Who is that? Not my job to hire the future GM, but I do think that sometimes you get too close to the product. And so I guess I just kind of rambled a little bit, but ultimately I feel like Don feels comfortable doing this soft sell because I do think ownership and management are on the same page. Like Scott said, they are going against the old people always say, and I've been right there at times, the Jacobs just want the playoff gate. I think this year they're not about the playoff gate necessarily, and that goes against their history, but I think they deserve credit for that because I do think they're all on the same page.
I want to say two things to that. So first of all, I feel like the injuries, as hard as they are to like have to hear about and deal with, like when it's your two top defensemen, that really, it gives you a reason to kind of throw in the towel a little bit, like more so than if they were healthy and you're saying to yourself, well, they're back and they're, here we go. Like what were we talking about before Nations? We were talking about, oh, Lindholm's going to be back and McAvoy is like heating up and, this could be the turnaround that they need and treat these guys like the deadline acquisitions because, they're back in the lineup and they could really help you. Well, that's not the conversation anymore. And that's the backdrop to this press conference, which is, we don't have two of our major pieces that it would take to be successful this year. So it's unrealistic to think this is like, if we just add one thing right now, like, no, you're relying on your depth right now. Like you're relying on your system's depth to call people up from Providence and to get minutes and to make the most of a really crappy situation with the injuries. And so it seems like that was easier to swallow and in a way maybe helps Sweeney keep his job or make a better case for himself, that it's like, okay, well, what were we supposed to do in this situation? Like the timing of these injuries were bad. The news that we got about Lindholm that came late, that we decided to change course, like came at a really bad time. And the injury at Four Nations to McAvoy came at a terrible time. And like the argument's definitely there to be made that what could he really do this trade deadline to push him over the hump? And that's where the acceptance, I think, comes from a lot. Right. So, and one thing that he talked about he did talk about the offseason, and this is kind of where I heard like a sales pitch a little bit in the back of my mind, which was like, he was like, we're going to have so much cap. Like the offseason is when we're going to do this. Like it was like giving up at the deadline this year, like nothing crazy can happen at this deadline, but the offseason, just wait for the offseason. We're going to go crazy. Like we're going to we're going to make big moves then. So it kind of felt like hey, this is my sales pitch for, I already am thinking, I'm on the phones. And he mentioned this too, like I'm on the phones with everyone right now. And maybe that's just priming another conversation to be had at the draft or in the off season. And, when other things are happening, like right before free agency. So it kind of felt like he was like, listen, I'm talking to everyone as if like there's going to be future conversations about bigger moves in the off season. So there was certainly like a future spin on it, even though it's not anything crazy gonna happen, it seems like, at the deadline.
Yeah, I mean, like especially the kind of deals like I've talked about of like finding someone with term who's going to help you for years to come. Like a lot of times those deals get made in the off season, not so much right before the deadline. So like that's exactly that kind of deal where it's like maybe they touch base on something now, doesn't quite come together, and you revisit it leading up to the draft. And yeah, like in terms of like how the injuries impact it, it's like, all right, take the extremes off the table, like an all-out buy or an all-out sell, like take those off the table. So let's say like if there was any sort of internal battle of, soft buy versus soft sell, it's like, well, the soft sell people, now that you have Hampus Lindholm most likely done for the year, and Charlie McAvoy out for at least some period of time. It's like now you go to like the soft buy people, and it's like, are we really still gonna add? Like, are we really gonna do that? Do you really still want to do that even with the 2 defensemen out? And then just circling back a little bit, one last thing I would bring up on, the relationship between ownership and management. Remember at the gala/gala/gala, we don't have to bring this back up again, but
someone will put the link in again to like the pronunciation of it.
Charlie Jacobs, when he was like just extolling Don Sweeney's virtues and talking about him being the GM of Canada, and that shows the respect from his peers. Well, as much as I'd like to forget it, how did Team Canada just do in Four Nations? Did they win the tournament? So, like Charlie Jacobs, I would think would be pretty impressed by that too.
Yeah. Well, but couldn't anyone be the GM of Team Canada? You could be. I could be. My cat could be. Like, you have Connor McDavid. Like, what do you? It's Team Canada. Like, to be honest with you, I thought that if they lost that tournament, it would have been. It could have maybe dented perception of him. But
there's some moves that worked out, like whether it's going with Jordan Binnington, even though he doesn't have good numbers this year, or calling in Thomas Harley, who like really stepped up for that team.
Yeah. Well, I had seen criticism of maybe not, because there was fighting allowed and it was going to be like, it turned out to be a pretty physical tournament. Like maybe he didn't build a physical enough team.
Or even like along those, the opposite of that, like there were people who were like, why is Sam Bennett there? He shouldn't be on this team. And Sam Bennett more than earned his keep. Like,
oh yeah,
scores a couple.
I wouldn't have personally been in the camp saying, why would Sam Bennett be on this team? That's kind of crazy. But
there was a lot of Canadian coverage during the Four Nations between U.S. and Canada games, where they were not happy with the construction of the Canadian roster, saying you got the Kachucks out there running wild, JT Miller running wild, and then Team Canada has Seth Jarvis and Travis Konechny, who are smaller guys, when guys like Mark Scheifele and Tom Wilson could have been there to help, that play with some edge and some skill. So obviously it worked out for Canada. But at the end of the day, ultimately, as pertains to the relationship, yeah, like I said, I think they're really close. And that's kind of why I wanted to prompt you guys earlier on. How do you feel comfortability wise with Don Sweeney going forward? Because I feel like a lot of fans, more so than not, feel as though that, look, Sweeney's been here for a decade. He's done a good job. He's given the team an opportunity. Even that's subjective and we'll get a lot of pushback. But ultimately, the team's been very competitive with him as a GM. You went to Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals at home. You lost. And then 2022, 2023, that's all on the players. Like, the GM did the best he could that year to give him a cup-winning roster, and he did. They just fell flat as a group. But, I just feel like you're with a team for a decade. That's very, very rare. Very rare to be a GM for a decade. And, of course, when you're constantly going to the playoffs, you're not going to get looked at to lose your job quite often, but I just think sometimes you get too close and fresh eyes are needed. And clearly ownership doesn't feel that way. I don't think this group, this faction of the Jacobs and Neely are going anywhere. And I think Sweeney is going to be in town until they maybe miss the playoffs in consecutive seasons. And that could happen, but until that does, I don't think he's going anywhere, whether fans want it or not. And if he does get fired after the season, I would be blown away due to the dynamics we're speaking of.
I think coaching is kind of where I'm looking at right now. Like, and I know that's, it's not really what people probably want to see. There's a lot of people who want to see Don Sweeney not be making the decisions anymore. But I think, there's a reason why interim is still on the coaching tag for Sacco. I think the coaching staff has not helped the situation this year. Power play, penalty kill has been bad. We've talked about it many, many, many times. And it feels like there should have been at least some buttons that were, pushed that made a difference. And I feel like we haven't seen that. So maybe we see another coaching change in the offseason rather than Sweeney again. That doesn't look great either, though, does it? Because that's another coach, 3 coaches in not that long of a time with Cassidy, Montgomery, and then if Sacco goes in the offseason, like that also speaks to the GM, that you have to be in that situation with coaches. But yeah, I also wanted to get to the poll because that you put up, Scott, because it's kind of funny.
Before you get to that, can I throw out one thing? If the Pittsburgh Penguins decide that they think it's time to move on from Mike Sullivan, I would be all over him. I would bring him back. Like,
oh my goodness,
I still think, especially after watching Four Nations, I know he had an incredible roster, but the way he got that team to come together and play team defense, like collectively as a 5-man unit with such short time to get ready, I still think he's a damn good coach when he actually has a good roster. I think the Penguins have just given him an absolute shit roster for like the last 4 to 5 years.
Yeah. No, if the right coach comes available, then make that change. That's for sure. And Mike Sullivan would be a great one. If the Penguins do decide to move on from him, obviously he's been there for a long time. But yeah, Brian, did you have anything to say about that before I can read the poll results?
Nope, all you.
Okay, so the question was, which we sent this out during or right before Sunday skate. To really
I think this was a Ken Laird poll.
Oh, this is a Ken Laird poll. It looked like something Scott would do. So, all right. So the question was, the Bruins are 1 point out of a playoff spot with 24 games to go. Oh, I can tell you didn't write this because there's a grammatical issue here. What should they do at the deadline?
Get your shit together, Ken.
Yeah, sorry, Ken. I just throw my boss under the bus. There's a grammar problem with this question. So,
and tag me next time, Kenny.
The options to vote were add ! Make a run this year. Second was stand pat, which got the least amount of votes. The third one was minor retool for the future. And the fourth one was blow it up. And as with a few of the calls we got on Sunday skate, blow it up is very popular. It is tied with minor retool. Those are the two way more popular answers of 42% for both. And
there is technically a first and second because I'm on the web version.
There is technically, well, what does it say to you? Mine says 42.5 and 42.1.
Yes, you can't negate the extra decimals.
Okay, but I voted twice for retool.
Oh, well, there it is. That's why.
So I'm just gonna call it even because I voted on the skate pod and my own account, because then otherwise you can't see what the poll answer is. So I clicked it to see what it was with my real answer, and I think I may have tipped the scale slightly, but I'm gonna call it a tie. They're both right around 42%. Stand paddling at 3%, and make a run had 12%. So it was. I don't know about you guys, but the blow it up doesn't make sense to me. And we got calls saying McAvoy out, like basically everybody, but Pasternak was kind of like what multiple calls said. So that doesn't. I don't know.
I mean, like we touched on this on the show, but I think people are lying. I think there's 42%. I think most of them are lying.
I think they don't know what blow it up means.
How any fan could possibly want to blow it up unless they have do people understand what that means? Like, do people understand what a tear it down to the studs rebuild looks like? It is 10 years minimum of sucking, of being completely irrelevant, of being nowhere close to the playoffs every year. And yeah, there are some examples. There are the Chicago Blackhawks who sucked the entire 2000s and eventually built the Stanley Cup team. The Colorado Avalanche, 12 years of sucking and eventually won a cup. The Edmonton Oilers got to a Stanley Cup final last year after 15 years. Well, not 15 years of sucking, but maybe 10 years of sucking and then like another 5 of slowly building up.
Yeah.
Those are the success stories. The success stories took 10 to 15 years. The failures, ask the Buffalo Sabres fans how blow it up, tear it down, rebuild is going. Ottawa Senators, Red Wings, Canadians, on and on and on. The San Jose Sharks are in the middle of one right now. The Anaheim Ducks have been in the middle of one. Like, I refuse to believe there are fans who actually want that, who actually want their team to suck for a decade. I just can't imagine anyone wanting to watch that.
I think
like,
maybe we're all a little bit down in the dumps. It's late in February. It's cold. It's dark. We need a little bit of sunlight. Maybe people are just having a bad time with the weather, and they're just not feeling very positive. But you're right. Like, I don't want to watch a rebuild. It make me quit. I don't want to do that.
See, I think people think like a rebuild is what a retool actually is. Like, a retool generally takes 3 to 4 years. I think people think that's a rebuild, and it's not. Like,
no, a rebuild is you trade all your good players for draft picks and then draft a whole new team. Like, essentially is like a big part of a rebuild / blowing it up. It's like, we're trading our good players for the first round picks of other teams, and then we're just hoping we draft, great talent at, when we give up all the way and we're drafting number 1, number 2 overall. Like, do you know how long it takes to be that bad to even get a first overall pick, to then start going back up? Like, and if you're not getting in the first 3 picks, like, how's your rebuild actually going? Because like a real true rebuild is normally based around getting a number 1, number 2 overall pick and getting a Macklin Celebrini and getting a Connor Bedard. And then like, even those, tell me how those are going.
The Oilers had to get 4 number 1 picks before they finally hit on McDavid. Like, they had to do that 4 times.
They had Taylor Hall. They had Nugent Hopkins.
The Sabres have had 3 of them. One's already gone, Jack Eichel. Rasmus Dahlin and Owen Power. Good players. Are the Sabres any closer to winning it all?
Yeah. I think a retool can also take as soon as a year. And I think we've all talked about that as well. I mean, the Capitals are an example. And like, a retool doesn't have to be 3 to 4 years. It could be anywhere from an off season to maybe 3 or 4 years. And I think the 3 of us here, and I think a lot of Bruins, well, maybe not in the poll, but I think most Bruins fans out there think that a retool.
As we're speaking, the blow it up number has gone up.
Well, I will say the stand pat option.
Brian was voting while I was talking.
I will say, I feel like the stand pat option that justifiably got essentially no votes, and I mean that even being an option, I can understand throwing it on there, but I mean that's like the worst.
Are you trying to be mean to Ken again? Are we all just being mean to Ken?
Well, no, I just think that's like objectively the worst thing that this team could have done was do nothing. I don't think anybody in the poll shows would say do nothing. It's either, whatever. We've already talked about that. But listen, guys, there are some examples in the Bruins history of retools. Now, it's actually interesting because for the first time in almost 20 years, we're talking about the Bruins selling at a deadline. If you look back, even if it's a soft sell, if you look back at the last 2 times the Bruins missed the playoffs, which was the 2014-15 and 2015-16 season, those teams missed the playoffs in like the last week of the season. And in one circumstance, it was the very last game. So at that deadline, they were trying to add. Now, you could sit there and say, well, what's the difference between those years when they were trying to make the playoffs at the deadline and this year? Well, this year, this team is far more injured and banged up. Their team analytics are terrible. And I would also argue, I'd have to go back and look, but I'm sure at the time, those Bruins teams were in the playoffs until they weren't at the very end of the season. You have to go back until 2006, 2007, where the Bruins were deemed a seller. And if you look back at that year, it was actually more similar to what I think Scott and others and myself and you, Bridget, are really saying this year, which is make some hockey trades and do some soft selling. I believe that the Bruins traded Milan Jurčina, remember that name, to the Washington Capitals for a 2008 conditional 3rd or 4th round pick. And I think that pick turned into TJ Brody. Whatever happened to TJ Brody? Did that pick not end up with Boston? Does that ring a bell to you, Scott? Was TJ Brody a eventual Bruins draft pick? No, that pick must have gone somewhere else.
Yeah, they must have traded that pick again.
Okay. The Bruins. Okay, the Blackhawks acquire Chris Versteeg and a 2008 conditional 5th round pick for Brandon Bachenski.
Okay. Yeah, that one didn't work out.
No, but there's an example of a player for player. This one did work out for the Bruins. Wayne Primo, Brad Stewart, and an 08 conditional 4th round pick to Calgary for Andrew Ference and Chuck Kobasu. Now, Chuck Kobasu didn't end up being a Stanley Cup champion with Boston, but he was a pretty integral part of that 07-08 team, which got the Bruins back on the map, and the 08-09 team, which was a damn near President's Trophy winner. And I think he may have had some injury issues, and he eventually got traded. I'm curious what that trade would have been, because that, I think, probably led to the 2011 personnel potentially. Aaron Ward was traded to the Bruins for Paul Mara. Aaron Ward was a good Bruin in his time in Boston. And the Bruins traded Brad Boyes for Dennis Weidman. So that was more player-for-player swaps than it was straight selling for collateral. But you have to go back almost 20 years, guys, where there's Bruins chatter going into a deadline where this is the situation that's at hand. But again, that was would you call that a soft sell or a retool? Because, 5 years later, they're hoisting the Stanley Cup. Now, the big difference then is at least the Bruins had a future number 1 center in Patrice Bergeron, a young one at that, going into a retool. Right now, yes, the Bruins have Pastrnak and they have McAvoy and Swayman. That's great. But it's uncomfortable going into a retool knowing that we have no idea where that next number 1 center is coming from. But I'll give you guys the floor because I just went for a couple minutes straight.
I mean, they're hoping Matt Poitras, right? But that's the hope, I guess. If you want to think about who they have right now, but
not 1C though. I don't think even they're thinking that.
Did people think that Bergeron was going to be a 1C when he was drafted?
Not when he was drafted, but I think by like 06, you were starting to think that.
I mean, Matt Poitras hasn't even scored a goal at the Garden this year. I think he has 1 goal this year. I mean, the comparison there is I like Matt Poitras, but
no, and don't get me wrong. I'm not comparing anyone to Bergeron.
Yeah,
I would not compare anyone to Bergeron.
No,
but
I know.
Yeah, I just like if your best plan or like your most straightforward plan is, well, let's hope that Poitras turns into a 1C. I just think that's a very flawed plan. Like, look, maybe I'll be wrong, but I don't really see him being more than a 2C. So I still think
which is still totally fine. Like that's right, totally fine for him.
Right, but we're talking about you need a 1C.
Yeah, which would mean getting it from outside, not drafting it. Really, like that's what the swing at Zacha was about.
Or getting a good enough pick to draft it, which I know Brian's talked about plenty. Like, is there a way to trade up and even if you're not picking in the top 7 or 8, is there a way to get in there?
What I'm saying is, it probably wouldn't be your own pick.
It's close, though, Bridget. It's close.
If you're not truly failing.
If they're without McAvoy and Lindholm, which we think certainly Lindholm, but let's just say hypothetically that you go. Let's just say out of the next 25 games, you go 25 without Lindholm, and close to that, maybe 15 at least without both Lindholm and McAvoy, and that coincides with sending away a couple of players potentially at the deadline. As it stands right now, the Bruins would have the 14th overall pick in the draft. They're not, if they go 500 down the stretch these last 25 games, their own pick could very well be close to top 10, just naturally. So I think that's their best bet, and that's kind of why I'm glad. I'm not glad people are getting injured, but like if we're talking about I'm glad that the Bruins are looking at the reality of what their team is at this point. The combination of injuries and underperforming and everything, all of it. I just think that I'm glad that they're trending out of the playoffs, and I'm glad that they're approaching the deadline as such, because I think that it's not even what's best for the team long term. It's what's best for the team, I think, as soon as this October. So, because I do think that you can get some draft collateral, and I do think that even if your own first round pick this year isn't a top 10 pick, you're going to be close enough to entice a team to swap with you. Because like I said last week or the week before, if the Bruins had the 28th overall pick in the first round, like they do many years, 25 to 30, 32, it's very difficult to convince a team in the top 10 to trade down, to the end of the first round. But if you're already at 12 or 11, it's a totally different ballgame. So if they can hit on some draft picks, if they can spend wisely in the summer, and that kind of leads to my question to start, which is, do you trust Sweeney with all this? But at the end of the day, whether it's Sweeney or somebody else, I feel much better about the Bruins heading into this offseason with how things are trending, because I think it's going to be best for the team than if they were trying to buy and keep UFAs for a playoff run that they currently aren't qualified for. So I think we're going to have to eat crow for 25 games here. It's not going to be fun. Sucks for David Pastrnak to have to go out there and, they're not technically out of it. We should, we can keep saying that, but yeah, this team knows what they are, and I think they're going to act as such. And I think it's good ultimately.
My opening shift too, and we touched a little bit on it, but I think there's more to be said about the UFA stuff, because like putting Marchand aside, because maybe we'll know about that soon, it sounds like the future does not include the UFAs, and Sweeney made a divider between that and RFAs, which meaning Morgan Geeky. The timeline for that was different, he said, not naming him by name, but we know he's an RFA. It seems like Frederic is gone. It seems like Wotherspoon and Brazeau have started to be phased out already. Those are guys that I'm not sure you get anything for. Maybe you do. Maybe you try, obviously. But maybe those are guys that walk at the end of the year if no one finds that they might be valuable. Or if there's, a draft pick or something to come back for those guys. And Frederic is the most interesting, because Frederic has had such a difficult season that the value has gone down. And maybe if he got like a new scenery, fresh start, his play comes back up to where it was last year, but it doesn't seem like that's going to happen in Boston either, for one reason or another. Maybe he's dealing with something, like he can't get out of his funk, but he hasn't brought the normal, Trent Frederic passion, fire, and some of the other attributes that made him valuable for a playoff team. So to me, it stinks in that Frederic, if he was a UFA last year at the deadline, like maybe you get more for him than you're going to get this year. But
yeah, I don't want to overstate it though. You'll get something for him.
Yeah, you'll get something for him. But
I think Trent Frederic's going to have value no matter what. Like, there's teams that want him. And we were talking on Sunday Skate today, and Rachel said 3rd round pick. I think there's a decent chance you get a 2nd round pick. And if there's enough of a bidding war, it might even be a little more than that. I don't know the way he's played, I can't really imagine he gets to a 1st, but maybe it's a 2nd and a 5th or like something like that. Like, I actually still think you'll get a fairly decent return on Trent Frederic, even with all the struggles, just because I think teams have seen him be a really effective 3rd liner who can hit and score some goals. And even in a down year, there's teams that are going to want that. And there aren't it's not like the market's like loaded with guys like that. So,
and
I
he's
think even with the down season, like I think you're gonna get a decent return.
yeah, it's just not as much. And he's like one of the most athletic people I've ever met. Like when you watch him before games, like he can play. I don't know this doesn't affect hockey, but like he was good at every sport. Like he just has this. Like I'm not sure if the hockey IQ is necessarily there, but like his actual like abilities that he was just kind of born with, it seems like are pretty high. It's just can he put it together? Maybe new coaching, new system. I don't know.
Well, I was just gonna say, I mean, I know Scott McLaughlin, so everybody is battling uphill as far as the most athletic person that I know, because Scott is just on another level. But
guys, no one can snowboard into a tree like me.
Hey, but real talk though, like just I will say, UFA status aside and trade deadline approach aside, what a disappointment! What a disappointment Trent Frederic has been, because he was a player that was trending up for this team. I mean, he had turned himself. You can say what you want about the 2022-2023 roster being stacked and playing with Hall and Coyle. But I mean, last year he didn't have Taylor Hall, and just the last 2 years he was a very physical presence that could stand up for teammates, and he started to find his confidence and his scoring touch. And heading into this year, we're having conversations, and I'll admit that I was dead wrong, but there was a second line vacancy on the wing on the right side, and I thought that out of camp he had a chance, to, if he kept improving his game, to take that spot and see what he could do with it. And he has been terrible, absolutely terrible from start to finish. And Charlie Coyle, we haven't mentioned his name in a while, but again, major disappointment. But at least Frederic had more youth on his side. And, to have a guy, I know the league's not tough like it was in the 80s and the 70s and the 90s, but to have a guy on your team that can score 20 goals and put up 15, 20 assists and fight, stand up for his teammates and drag his team into the fight, it's a very valuable player to have. And when Trent Frederic was on his game, he was that. But he's just been incredibly inconsistent. And then this year, he's just been consistently bad. And it's disappointing because, you spend a first-round draft pick on somebody. He takes a while to develop. I remember 3 years into his career, I was telling you guys in this podcast before he broke out in 22-23 that I was done with them. And I'm from... Again, this is a podcast. We're talking about a hockey team, so I'm not sitting here damning the individual. But from a production standpoint, he didn't have it, so I didn't think he was helping the team. And we have to, critique the team that we're watching. And then for 2 consecutive years, he showed us what he could do, and he evolved. And normally in this league, you continue that growth. And wow, just what a disappointment! I did not see this happening this year.
Yeah, I mean, what I was just thinking is like, because we mentioned him earlier, like there's a timeline where Trent Frederic becomes more or less Sam Bennett. Like that would have been awesome. And there's no like real reason why he could, like, if you look at Sam Bennett's numbers, it's like he's never had a 50-point season, but he went from, early in his career, it was kind of consistently like 25 to 30 points. He had one 36-point outlier. And then, like, age 25, he breaks out with 28 goals, 49 points, and has been over 40 points every year since. And obviously brings the physicality and all that. And it's like, Trent Frederic could be that. Like, that's not that far out of reach for him. And yet, a season like this, you're just like, wow, it feels like that's a long ways off. Like, last year, you might have said, okay, maybe I can see that. Like, that there's signs of him maybe being that kind of player. And then, yeah, this year it's like, nope, it's not even close. It's just such a big step back.
So I know we're going to get going here pretty soon. There was a couple of things that, Scott, you asked about Lysell and Merkulov, and I found that answer interesting. I don't know if we totally wrapped up the Marchand stuff yet with Bridges' opening shift. And I don't know if you guys had a ton more to add on that. I think I would just say before we started recording, I mentioned to you guys that when Marchand went on What Chaos with DJ Bean and Pete Blackburn, he was asked about being mentioned in trade rumors and how it would feel to ever be traded away from Boston. He said it would be very weird. And, he says all the right things that, he doesn't want to, leave Boston. I think if you were to read body language and the tenor of his voice, I think, it sounded like somebody who was unsure of his fate, because ultimately, certain players have no movement clauses, but Marchand is a pending UFA. And I don't know does he have any clauses right now in his last year of his contract? I don't know, but
he has an eight team trade list.
Okay, so he can go to most of the league without technically being consulted. So he just seemed a bit unsure despite wanting to stay in Boston. And when you hear Don Sweeney's comments today about now that Four Nations is done, we're gonna circle back and
you want me to read the quote?
Yeah, please.
So the question was like, is Brad Marchand going to be a lifelong Bruin or something along those lines? And the answer was, this is the quote: "That's always been my ultimate goal. We've been in negotiations with Brad and communicating with him throughout the year. We'll have to have a conversation now that Four Nations is over and sit down with Brad and his representatives and have a clearer path in the next weeks as to what the outcome will be."
So if that path is unclear or there's still some distance at that point, I mean, what else can you do, right? Like, are the Bruins going to go into the offseason with a lot of question marks about if they can re-sign this player, and if they end up not being able to, losing him for nothing? Or do you feel like maybe he's only worth a second-round pick anyway, and it's worth the gamble to see if he can work something out in the summer? How do you guys feel about this Marchand situation?
Yeah, I feel like you have to at least know if you're on the path to getting an extension done. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be done by March 7th, but if the two sides have honest conversations with each other and they realize, like, all right, we want the same thing, we're close enough, we're not going to figure this out right now, but we'll get there. Like, you have to at least know that. And both sides have now said publicly that they want him. Marchand says he wants to be a Bruin for life. Sweeney says he wants to make Marchand a Bruin for life. Well, there's some reason that hasn't happened yet. And the one thing that keeps coming into my mind, and I haven't confirmed this with anyone, so I'm not reporting anything, but it's like, well, is the hang up how this looks moving forward? Is it are the Bruins at a point where they want to go year to year with Marchand? And Marchand says, I'm going to play until I'm 40. I want a 3 or 4 year deal. Because, by the way, that's another thing he said. What was that on What Chaos, or was that somewhere else? Where he said, I've always had 40 in my mind.
That was Chaos.
Yeah. So, we know he has that number in his mind. So he might be thinking, just sign me until then. Why would I want to do 1 year deals for the next 4 years? So that's where I wonder if there's a real hang up. And I do think kind of, if that is the issue between now and March 7th, you have to figure out if you can get close enough to bridge that. Because if they're going to dig in where it's Bruins want to go on 1 year deals and Marchand wants a 4 year deal, I don't think you're going to bridge that. So that's where I would be well, maybe you do trade him. Maybe you do have to really seriously consider that.
Obviously, it depends on cost, right? But are you guys chomping at the bit to sign a 36-year-old to a 4-year contract, despite who it is, regardless who it is? I mean, again, the dollar amount matters in that situation. We don't know that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if it's $3 million a year, sure.
Yeah.
But if he wants market value, which even at his age is, I mean, if we're being honest, it's probably around $7 million is probably Marchand's market value right now.
Yeah.
I'm not doing that. I'm not going 4 years, $7 million a year.
Is it fair to ask why this was postponed post Four Nations? I'm not saying that Sweeney and Brad's representatives weren't talking before, but given the pending UFA status, maybe the Bruins thought that they wouldn't be in the situation of being sellers at the deadline, and that it could have been ironed out in the offseason because they weren't going to be in a position to have to maybe sell. Maybe that's what happened. Because it seems a little bit irresponsible to leave this up for there's so much time in a season and an off season. Like, this is on the horizon at some point. So the only thing I can think of is that Don Sweeney and the Bruins never thought that they'd be possibly selling at the deadline this year. They'd be a playoff team adding top 6 talent probably, which is what we all talked about in the offseason, and that they would figure it out in the summer. They definitely probably viewed it at worst case scenario. We'll keep Brad as our own rental when it comes to that time, and then we'll figure it out in the summer. And I think they kind of got caught with their pants around their ankles because now they're sellers soft sellers, retool, whatever. And now they're like, fuck, we got to kind of figure this out. That's what I think happened.
Yeah, I mean, we know they've been talking, so I don't know. Maybe it's just like the two sides haven't really had a reason to budge all that much, and now you are kind of getting down to crunch time where it's like, okay, we got to figure this out. And just one last thing from me, because it just popped in my head, but back whenever it was, like November or whatever, maybe even end of October, when Elliot Friedman reported that they were closing in on an extension, which obviously ended up not being true, he said it was expected to be 3 years. So like that was the number then. So I don't know what that means. But I don't know. Like, were the Bruins at some point willing to go to 3? Who knows?
There was no dollar reported, right? Back then?
No.
I wanted to ask you guys quickly before we send off about Scott's question about some of the younger players. But Bridget, you haven't had a chance to talk about Marchand. Did you have any comments on this, or should we move on to the next topic?
I mean, I guess we're just wait and see. Like that's really all that we can do. I have the quote up about Lysell and Merkloff. If you want me to read that?
Yeah.
So
please.
Scott asked this question about their, are they going to get opportunities to play in Boston this year again? And Sweeney said, yeah, if they're playing well, you're going through a good playoff positioning stretch down there. Both those two players are contributing nightly or on a nightly basis and working through. They both played up here. Sorry, this is like grammatically, like this was just the answer. I'm not stumbling. This is just what here to us.
Well, yeah. Those, I think it was like they're working through period new sentence.
Yeah. I think everybody's indicated necessarily where they are, but that's the nature of the job. So it'll continue. The volume will continue to pick up.
I think you jumped to a different quote there.
Oh yeah, I did.
I have the.
Wait, no, I have it. Just wait. I got lost. Basically,
I have it in my article if you want me to.
I have it here.
Okay.
But no, both those players are contributing on a nightly basis, working through. They both played up here. If their game merits it, they're going to get a good opportunity to play. Yeah.
Okay, so like a couple of things. I mean, have they not? Has their play to this point not merited a call up at all? I mean, Merkulov continues to lead the Bruins down there in points as he has.
Just scored an overtime game winner on Sunday.
I mean, he's only been leading the team in scoring for the last couple of years. I mean, you can make more of an argument about Lysell's point production. He's got 37 points in 54 games, but Merkulov, I hear that quote and I just think to myself, I just think that's full of shit. I think they could be lighting the world on fire, and I think that prior to this point, the team's been unwilling to call up anybody who has some offensive upside because they don't we've said this before. They want the safer players that have NHL experience that won't quote unquote turn the puck over and cost them 2 points in the standings, even though they can't score anyway. So they're losing points in the standings because they can't score.
Did you guys enjoy another iteration of the Riley Tufte experiment on Saturday?
God. Let's just say it was very Tufte to watch. Very Tufte to watch. I just don't know why they would call them up now if they play well when they want to do it before. And I don't think, to answer my own question, I don't think they would. I think the only time that the Bruins will call these players up is if they wave the white flag with like 10, 12 games left, 15 games left, if they have really just fallen out of playoff contention and mathematically, I think then there's nothing to lose in the standings. But I mean, Scott, I see you getting ready to talk, but do you see them bringing them up?
The one thing I've been clinging to is maybe they're just waiting till the deadline, figure out who's going out, roster spots get opened up, you call them up then. And, and the reason you keep around, even though I don't think you need to, like the reason you keep around your Oliver Wahlstrom and, Cole Koepke and whoever is because you think they're at least NHL caliber players and they're going to plug in somewhere after the deadline as well. And then you have those guys and you bring up some younger guys. Like, I don't agree with it. I would just have Merkelov and Lysell up here now. I don't need to watch any more of Oliver Wahlstrom. I didn't need Riley Tufte called up. Like, I would have those guys in now, but that's the only other thing I can cling to where it's like, see what the roster looks at like after March 7th, and then they get their chance for the last month and a half.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, Frederic leaves potentially, maybe Brazeau, maybe somebody else up front, but I'm just not convinced they want to just put in Tufte again and Vinny Lettieri, and who, again, nothing against Vinny Lettieri, but like, I feel like there's enough guys that they've called up before that could, theoretically fill out those roster spots. So I just got to, what you're saying is not wrong, Scott. I don't want to poo-poo that possibility. I guess I just got to, for me, I need to see it to believe it at this point. And hey, I guess we'll find out. Bridget's phone is overheating. We gotta let her cool that bad boy off. It's probably from trying to read that quote.
Laptop. Don't even get me started on my laptop.
She was trying to read the quote about both the young guys and started sparking on her.
Quickly, one other
yeah.
One other thing I'd point out prospect-wise, John Farinacci has 10 points in his last 10 games down in Providence, and I thought had a really good preseason up here. So just another name to keep an eye on. He might. I wouldn't be surprised if he gets a look at some point.
Well, that's an area that Sweeney has done well at. I think pretty unanimously, which is identifying some NCAA talent. Was Farinacci undrafted, right?
No,
he reached the end of his he was drafted and just never went to the team and just waited for that to expire.
With who? Do you remember?
He played out his full career at Harvard, which by the time he left was enough time to.
I mean the drafted team.
I forget. I don't.
Was it Arizona? Was it Arizona? I don't know if it was Arizona. I think it might be somebody else.
Yeah, it was Arizona. Third round in 2019.
Wow, I pulled that one out of my ass.
That's the same as Mike Callahan. I like. Unfortunately, they don't have that plan anymore. Just wait for the guys who don't want to sign with Arizona and just take them.
Well, yeah, Arizona, exactly. They're gone. So they're Utah now.
All right. Well, I think that more or less covers the press conference. Obviously, there's a lot more to unfold as it plays out in front of us, but it seems, just to put a bow on it, it seems as though the Bruins, they're not going to. It doesn't appear that they're fooling themselves anymore. Like, they're not going to be like, well, we can make the playoffs and you never know. Because to Bridget's point, I think they're looking at the injuries now piling up, and I think it's just helping them be like, okay, even if we make what are we going to do without Charlie McAvoy, Hampus Lindholm? It's just it's taken a lot for them to finally come to this realization. Took fans a little bit less throughout this season, but I think everybody's at the same spot now. I think the biggest divide going forward amongst fans will be, does the GM stay? Does the GM go? And stuff like that. But and not disregarding the possibility of making some quote unquote buys or hockey trades that help that are not short term, that can help the team now and in the future. So I'm sure that it's not going to be just we're just selling. To Sweeney's points, he's going to look at all options, but in doing so, the inevitably gone players, they will trade. And up until this press conference, I couldn't definitively say that that's what their plan was, and that's what their plan is. They got to execute it, but that's good news, I think, for Bruins fans to hear. And again, just asset management is the key here. So I think they're going to do that. In the meantime, keep it here at the Skate Podcast for all of our coverage, and we'll be back talking to you guys on Wednesday. Bridget, Scott, any final words?
Nope, all good from me.
Yeah.
All righty. Thank you all very much for listening, and we'll talk to you on Wednesday. Hey guys, thanks for watching the Skate Podcast. If you want to see more of our videos, visit our playlist.
Not in front of a screen. You can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Don't forget to follow us on social media. And if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment.